Welcome to the show. I'm Mark Joseph. Thanks for joining us. Today our special guest is Michael Ramirez, a Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial cartoonist and the senior editor at Investors Business Daily. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Thanks. My pleasure to be here.
Well, thanks for coming in. Tell us about what you're up to. You've moved from the Los Angeles Times, where you spent about a decade, to Investors Business Daily. Tell us what you're doing right now.
Well, right now I'm at Investors as the editorial cartoonist, but I'm co-managing the editorial page with Wes Mann, who's the editor. And you know, basically at IBD we have a certain audience. We're trying to expand that audience. I think in terms of measurement, we have the best editorial page in the country now. You'll find good conservative bedrock values there, and we don't pull any punches. So I think it's a good enterprise. We've just expanded our page onto the internet, and you know, as we know, the internet is just a booming audience. At ibdeditorialist.com, and I think we're just trying to show that there actually is a different point of view in the mainstream media, because very often you're only getting your sourcing for the news from one side. Now, the news itself ought to be factual and objective, and I'm afraid in America these days that's not the case in most circumstances. But on the editorial page, the conservative point of view is not seen very often. At IBD, we come in from a factual point of view with conservative values. And I think that's something you don't see as well. And so we're trying to present that with the IBD editorial page.
Now, you wear two hats. Mm-hmm. You are daily doing cartoons for the paper, as well as your editorial duties. How does that work? How does that shake out? What kind of time do you spend on each? And what is a typical day like for you?
Well, you know, I really, as glamorous as editorial cartooning sounds, I mean, we're paid to be obnoxious, and believe me, I am. But it's all-encompassing. It's really, my job is really to be an editorial analyst, to analyze the news. And I just simply use a visual metaphor to convey my point of view. So it's really, it's the same thing, but on a broader scale at IBD as a senior editor. Basically, with Wes Mann and our writers, we have editorial meetings every morning. So my job is just to read as much about the news as possible in whatever format. You know, I read the New York Times and the LA Times and the Wall Street Journal and a myriad of other sources, the New Republic, the National Review, anything I can get my hands on, and just try to stay current on what's going on, and to read about the different facets of what's going on in the political realm, and try to think of what the consequences of these decisions our lawmakers are making in Washington, D.C. are for the general public, you know, stretched out over many, many years forward.
What about the cartooning side? I mean, you must, this is just a dream job for a lot of people. You get up in the morning, you read the newspaper, you pick out all the funny stories and the crazy things politicians do, and you get to poke fun at them all day. I mean, what is it like?
Well, you know, it's funny because I always tell people that I have the best gag writers in the world working for me, and they are politicians. And these days, you know, they're doing all the heavy lifting. You know, it's the Larry Craigs of the world that are making my job easy. At this point, I'm just doing stenography. But you could sort of look at editorial cartooning from this perspective. Editorial cartooning is a lot like advertising. The only difference is in advertising, they try to fashion a concise statement or a message to sell a product. In editorial cartooning, we're doing the same thing, but we're selling an idea. I think there's a terrible trend in editorial cartooning these days where the majority of editorial cartoonists are trying to fashion their job into being more like the Tonight Show monologue, where they're making fun of, making a humorous anecdote about current events. But editorial cartooning should be much more substantive than that. What we're trying to do is we're pursuing a philosophical agenda and trying to showcase what it is that our lawmakers are doing, and you know, giving them credit when they do the right things and excoriating them for doing the wrong things, to reveal that these are public servants and they operate in the interests of the general public. So my view on my job personally as an editorial cartoonist is I'm trying to find the most substantive issues that I think affect Americans, figure out what my point of view is on these issues. And it really is from a point of view of not being affiliated with any party. It's not a Republican point of view or a Democratic point of view. It's trying to find out what the plus and minuses are of an issue, break it down in terms of right and wrong. And then when I figure out what it is, the stand that I'm making based on that objective reasoning, then the subjective point of view comes out in the cartoon. And the cartoon is to sell that point.
Now I think you've had death threats over the years. You certainly get a lot of angry calls.
Sure.
What is that like?
That's just from my family. That's just embarrassing.
What is that like to wake up in the morning and have death threats in your voicemail?
Well, I think it's a good thing from this perspective. It's kind of strange, but people should be passionate about their politics. Politics should be about passion. It should be about broad ideas and visions of how the world ought to be. You should hold these close to your heart. So when I do the cartoons, if I don't get a response, then I know that I didn't quite accomplish my task, because people have very differing perspectives on how they want the world to be. If I get a death threat, that just, those are sort of like the ribbons and badges that we wear. That means I've succeeded in the mission of taking an issue and pushing it to an extreme, to a point where people will react. Because the bottom line is, in what I do as an editorial cartoonist and as a journalist, I look at this democratic republic that we have, and I wonder how terrible it is that we have the greatest nation in the world, the most powerful nation in the world, and more often than not, the person elected to run the country is elected by less than half the electorate. And when you take the eligible electorate, it's less than a quarter of the people that are eligible to vote are voting for the most powerful person to govern this nation. What I want to do is I want people to be involved. And my job as an editorial cartoonist and as a journalist is to be the catalyst, to make them think about the issues and to generate a response so that they'll get involved and be active.
How do you decide what to come up with for that day? Are you working ahead? Are you thinking of ideas for tomorrow? Mm-hmm. Are you going to looking at tomorrow's paper? What's your process for deciding what to cartoon about?
Well, it's all of the above, Mark. Basically, I read everything that I can. Now, I watch the news in the morning to see what's highlighted in the half hour and the hour segments, to see what's on the tip of everybody's minds. Unfortunately, the downside to my job is that I have to rely on people's knowledge of what's going on to be able to do a cartoon on it. In other words, if I pick an obscure issue that people are unfamiliar with, I really only have one window to familiarize them with the issue and to explain a point of view in it. So I can't really get the most obscure things unless I can really be very inventive and find a way to put it inside the cartoon. So mostly I'll do the topics that are high-profile topics that people are familiar with. You are always working ahead. Because we have access to the news before it comes out in print a day before. So we're always constantly looking at those things and mining those stories for editorials.
I've talked before to Charles Schultz and your colleague Steve Kelly. What are the differences between what you do and, say, what a Charlie Schultz does? How do you see that?
Well, Charles Schultz is entertaining. Sparky was his nickname. Sparky was far more inventive and creative than anything I could do. He was a genius at encompassing daily life and transforming it into these wonderful comic strips. What we do is more of an act of journalism, though. Steve and I. Steve's a terrific cartoonist. And Steve Kelly is also a stand-up comedian, so he brings that element into cartooning, which I think is invaluable. What we do is more on the scale of journalism. What we're trying to do is we're trying to teach people about politics, about their system of governance, about what their elected officials are doing, And what Sparky was doing with Peanuts is more entertainment. And this is where I think editorial cartoonists today have sort of lost the idea, the notion of what it is that we're supposed to be doing as an element of journalism, that we're supposed to teach the public, that we're supposed to be saying substantive things with our cartoons, and that's been lost, unfortunately. When I think about the body of work that I do, I can't think of a cartoon that I've ever done that I didn't agree with, that didn't have a substantive point. And I think every editorial cartoon ought to be able to reflect on their work in that vein.
Now you belong to an organization of editorial cartoonists, I believe.
Yes.
What's the breakdown ideologically? Liberal, conservative, center of the middle of the road? What do we have with your colleagues?
Well, there's an organization called the American Association of Editorial Cartoonists, which I'm a member and I was president of briefly. There's another organization called the National Cartoonist Society that also encompasses all the cartoonists and all the people that are in any sort of animation, cartooning, print, magazines, encompasses it all. The AAEC had a convention this year in Washington, D.C., which I did not attend, and I sort of jokingly told some of my friends that I thought it was kind of ironic that we would go to the birthplace of democracy to celebrate, 4th of July with a bunch of communists. Like every other journalistic endeavor, I'd say the vast majority of them are liberal.
What would the percentages be, would you guess?
Off the top of my head, I would say that we're probably outnumbered at least 9 to 1. If we have 10% conservatives represented in that group, I'd be surprised. It's probably less than that. But.
Is there a factor here? It seems to me over the years that liberals have been very funny in mocking and making fun of sort of conservatives. Conservatives were not very good at doing that back, and yet in recent years I see you, I listen to Rush and Paul Shanklin's comedy, Jabs Back. Has that tide shifted? Are conservatives learning to be funny and learning to mock their opponents instead of being so serious and uptight about it? Do you see that at all?
Yeah, I think they do, and especially in my art form. I'd say, one of my heroes in editorial cartooning was Paul Conrad. Now, Paul was very liberal at a time when the LA Times was a very conservative paper. In fact, that's why they moved him to the op-ed page. And when I went onto the editorial page at the LA Times, I insisted on being on the op-ed page to have the separation between our opinion and what the newspaper represented. But Paul was really a terrific editorial cartoonist because he brought these really dark cartoons with very precise points made in the cartoon, and there are such good, substantive, strong messages that you can't help with his great artistic ability to admire, because they're wonderful pieces of journalism. Now, Jeff McNelly sort of changed that. He was a cartoonist for the Richmond News Leader and became the Chicago Tribune. Jeff was a friend of mine, and he actually expanded that by having these great, wonderful, substantive messages, but he added an element of humor, and that element expanded the audience and just multiplied it. Humor is a very, very powerful weapon, and you can use it to facilitate reaching a much, much larger audience with your message, and Jeff did that. I mean, so I think people are beginning to realize that you may have a very bitter message, but you put that little pill of humor and you throw it in there with it, and it makes it digest a lot easier, and you'll reach much more people.
We'll be back in just a moment with Michael Ramirez. We're back with Michael Ramirez of Investors Business Daily. Do you think, we're talking about cartooning, of course, do you think you're actually changing people's opinions and minds and hearts, or are you reinforcing what people already believe?
You know, I think you're probably doing both. We're hoping that we do change people's minds. I mean, if you make a very strong point, I think you can. If you illuminate an issue in a creative way, I think it can change things. For instance, there was a time where I did cartoon when I was with the Memphis Commercial Appeal in Tennessee, where I would go down to the legislature a couple times a year and watch them pass bills. And like every state legislature, they always save the most controversial things for the very end, and they pile them all together so that you can't really see what they're passing. And at the time, it was in 1990, I think it was, and our nation was in the midst of a recession, and they couldn't afford you know, simple funding for schools and education, stuff like that. In Tennessee, the legislature is not allowed to raise their own pay. They have to do it by a vote, and there's no way Tennessee citizens would vote a pay raise for the legislature, and for good reason. But the Constitution never said anything, the state Constitution never said anything about retirement. And so it was almost in the morning, I think it was like 12:40 in the morning or something. They had attached this retirement pension bill for lawmakers into this unrelated water bill and passed it. I just happened to be sitting in the well of the House when they did it and just barely noticed it. So I ran down there and got the legislation and I read it. Just could not believe that they'd done this. So I told the Nashville bureau chief, you know, what had happened, and we decided he was going to write a story on it, and I figured since he was exposing it and bringing those things to light that I could do a cartoon and people would understand what I was doing. So I had this cartoon where I had this big pig who looked amazingly like the governor of Tennessee, not saying that it was, and his advisor was saying, well, you know, in light of the recession and the cutbacks, how can you justify a pension, increasing the pension for the legislature? And what are you going to do when there's a public outcry? And the pig had a big smile on his face and he said, retire. Now, when that story and the cartoon hit the papers, there was an overwhelming public response to it. And the legislature, who had already passed it, had to go back and actually rescind it. I'm a big believer in editorial cartooning having an impact. Basically, if we can put it in print to expose what is going on in politics to the readers, it also exposes to the politicians themselves that we know what they're doing. And that's what makes it such a powerful institution, journalism, because we are basically shining the light on the cockroaches and making them flee for safety. We are exposing what it is that they're doing in the form of government and making sure their constituents know what they're doing so that they can respond and they can make the changes. Because the power of one, the power of the constituent is there. People just need to realize this power.
What kind of feedback do you get? How do you process how you're doing your job well? You obviously have editors who look over your shoulder, but what about readers? How do you know when you're doing your job well? How do you know when boy, I just didn't hit it yesterday?
Well, you know, you're mentioning death threats. So death threat is a great way to know that you've hit a nerve. But if you have an overwhelming response, especially when you have these, now with the internet, you have these groups that are pretty well organized and pretty well coordinated. If you get a coordinated response, then you know you've probably done your job.
What are the topics that you try? Do you have topics that you stay away from? How do you deal, for instance, with abortion or homosexuality or KKK or racism? Or do you have topics that you just say, nah, I don't want to go there? Or do you go there?
You know, I do go there. I don't really limit myself. The only way I do limit myself as far as content and good taste, you know, you don't want to be you know, we're talking about humor in cartoons. I don't want to be humorous for the sake of humor with my cartoons, in the same way that I don't want to be controversial for the sake of controversy. There's a point to be made, and you have to think of the value of the point versus the controversy surrounded in the way that you've done it. For instance, when we had the space shuttle Challenger explosion, it was a terrible, terrible thing that happened with real heroes, real American heroes that are putting their lives on the line. The debate that occurred afterwards was on basically what NASA's priorities were, and because of their cost cutting, did that affect the safety of the shuttle? Now, I thought of an idea where I had remnants of the shuttle scattered across the sky with a bubble coming out of one of the pieces saying, these NASA cutbacks are killing us. It makes a good point, but the question is whether or not you make the point, is it in good taste in light of these 7 American heroes dying? And I decided it wasn't. There's another issue with Johnny Cochran where I thought of an idea when Johnny died, where he's in heaven and he's at Heaven's Gate, and St. Peter's saying, "I'm sorry, Johnny, if the halo don't fit, we don't admit." And it makes a great point, but then do you really want to define one person on one case rather than the span of things he's done over a lifetime? And I decided against it. So it's really a measure of good taste, and you sort of self-censor yourself. My newspaper is a family newspaper. I want to be able to show these cartoons to everyone and make the point without having to debate a controversial element that's not part of the point that I'm making. I did a cartoon where when the Intifada began, where there were really extremist elements on both sides, on the Palestinians and the Israelis, who were sort of firing this battle and this hatred. And it was called Worshipping Their God, and it was this wall that sort of looked like the Western Wall, but it was comprised of letters, H-A-T-E, which was hate. And I had a Jewish figure that was a conglomeration of sort of these extremist settlers and the extremist elements of the Jewish side. And I had this, this composite character that was a Muslim as well, who was kneeling on a prayer rug, but he had his shoes on, and so you knew that he wasn't a devout Muslim. And these people that were subverting their religion for hatred, really, to make the point. And boy, I got it from both the Palestinians and the Israelis. But the point was well made, and it was because these people were subverting their religion. They were actually giving in to hatred more than anything that had anything to do with religion whatsoever. Yeah. So it was worthy to go with that, what I knew would be a controversial metaphor, sort of using the Western Wall or a likeness of it to make that point.
Now, part of your craft is to take the physical features of people and sort of exaggerate them. Clinton with his bulbous nose and Bush with the small eyes. What is that like? How difficult it is to grab a person's essence and find these characteristics?
Well, actually it's pretty easy. I mean, you view people and their physical attributes immediately hit you. It's funny because I never really planned to become a political cartoonist. I've always had the ability, since I was a little kid, to look at something and to realistically depict it. And when I started doing caricatures, it was very difficult because they don't really look like that. You take the most noticeable physical attributes of a person, you just exaggerate them. And so nothing ever looked right. And it took me a while to sort of get that down. But now it's pretty easy. I can look and immediately see what features will stick out. What's interesting, I think, is what happens to these physical elements as these people are defined politically. For instance, if you look at Paul Conrad's Richard Nixon, at the beginning of the administration, he gets darker and more moribund as he gets more mired into Watergate, and pretty soon he's just this dark guy with a big shadow on his face. He's almost got a beard, and his eyes are sunk into the back of his head, and he just looks very, very dark. I think the same thing happened with the Clinton administration. I have a tendency, though, to sort of use their statements and the things they've done against them. My favorite Bill Clinton cartoon was when he adopted the dog Buddy. I had him taking Buddy to the vet's office, and Buddy has a thought bubble over his head, and he's saying, like I'm the one who needs to be neutered. Obvious ironic points that could be made.
Do you hear back from public figures who you've depicted either for ill or for commending you?
Oh, absolutely. You hear from both.
Tell us about some of those.
Well, there are numerous. I'm trying to think of I had a Tennessee senator once who called me up and excoriated me over the telephone over this cartoon that I did. And I've got a certain rule when people call me on the telephone that you know, part of my job is I want to be able to convince them of my position. I will not do a cartoon that I cannot substantiate. So I do want to go through the exercise of telling them why it is that I feel a certain way about whatever issue it is. And so, you know, I always tell my callers, and I get the nastiest phone calls, and I'll say, well, give me 2 minutes to explain to you why I did the cartoon, and then you can say whatever you want. And more often than not, they will let you. And more often than not, we will come to an agreement, a very civil agreement, that you know, we agree to disagree, or they can understand my point of view, and sometimes I've even persuaded them to change their point of view. In this circumstance, I won't mention him by name, but in this circumstance, he just yelled at me and yelled at me. Now, I went to Radio Shack and I got this great sound machine, and it has a button where you press on it, and it's a nuclear bomb being dropped from a high altitude, and it slowly falls down to the ground and just explodes. And so I just nuked him, basically, and then he hung up on me. But you know, I'm willing to debate any of these public figures. I've substantiated the cartoons. I believe in them. There's not a cartoon that I've done that I didn't think was right or couldn't defend.
We'll be back in just a moment with Michael Ramirez. We're back with our guest, Michael Ramirez of Investors Business Daily. Speaking of newspapers, the Los Angeles Times, your former employer, circulation is dropping. The internet is taking over the news business. What is happening? What is going on, not only at the Times, but broadly speaking, with physical newspapers?
You know, unfortunately, you have a contraction in the newspaper industry, which I don't think is good for the industry itself. You know, I liked it back in the old days where you had 2 major newspapers in a city, and because you had that competition, I thought it made the news much better. The quality of news that you were getting were much better. Because the corporatization of the news and these entities becoming giant corporate conglomerates, you know, they're just looking at the bottom line, which is, you know, they want to make a 23% profit margin or better. And unfortunately, I think what's suffering is the news itself, the content of the news. You know, they're sort of jettisoning all these high-paid columnists, but these are really the columnists that have built the bridges between the newspaper and the community. And if you let them go, then you exclude the very reason for the readers to take the newspaper, and I think that's unfortunate. I think part of it, though, is that the sensibility within the news itself. You know, you used to be able to look at a newspaper and you would read a story and you could believe in the objectivity of the presentation of the news, but I think that's changing because we're more reliant on less sources of news in the print division. Everything's handled by AP or the New York Times, and you've had these problems occurring with Andrew Ferguson, BBC, the New York Times, you know, Jason Blair. People don't believe the people that are giving you the news, and for good reason, because I think there is a slant in the news that you're getting. And so people, if you don't believe in what you're receiving, if you're cutting the ties to the community in terms of what personal local columnists are saying, then you're going to lose your readership. And unfortunately, I think that's what's happening.
How much of the lost readership is ideological and how much of it is just technological?
Well, you know, I'd say a good proportion of both. You know, it's ideological because the people who for years and years had read the newspaper are just kind of tired of being spoon-fed, philosophically slanted news. So you're losing that readership. It's technological because the new readers are now going to a different format to get their news, which is instantaneous, which is either television or the internet. And you know, me personally, I just love waking up, having a newspaper in my hands, being able to hold it and read it. But we have a new generation of readers that have grown up with a different access to news, which is the computer. And it's free, and it's very easy, and there's a broader spectrum of, and diverse spectrum of news that they can get. I think, you know, the print division is doing itself an injustice by thinking they're going to combat this problem by having a digested format and this kind of infotainment rather than solid journalism and solid news. And they go to this format to compete, but this is where the newspapers are making a big mistake. You know, they're not going to be able to compete with television or cable on instantaneous news because television and cable is going to beat them to it. They're going to have the live stories, they're going to have, you know, instantaneous coverage of the event. Where they can beat them, and what newspapers do well, is to give them the news not in a digested format, but in depth, so that you can find out everything that's going on with that particular story instead of just seeing the very top of the subject. And unfortunately, you know, the newspaper industry seems to be doing the digested format rather than in-depth coverage, and I think that's going to hurt the industry itself.
Let's say you're offered the position as the editor of the LA Times, the New York Times, Washington Post. Take your pick. What would you do differently day one?
Well, you know, the first thing I would do was I would institute a rule that says that we're going to expand the amount of sources that we use in our stories to incorporate all philosophical sides and try to present these stories more on a factual basis rather than with some sort of political agenda. You know, when I was at the LA Times, one of the things I would do is I'd read the paper and I would underline sort of stories that I didn't agree with, and I would give it to the op-ed page editor and say, you know, these things are completely inaccurate or they're slanted. And you know, when I would talk to John Carroll, who was the editor then, and tell him that I thought there were some things that were slanted. It's unfortunate. I don't believe in a liberal conspiracy, but I do think that most journalists are inherently liberal. As an editor of one of the major newspapers, the first thing I would do is make sure that they don't incorporate their own personal philosophy into that part of the news. You know, it's always funny when people call me up at my office and they say, you know, I read your opinion on the opinion page, and I want to say that you're, you know, you're very opinionated. And I have to say, well, that's why I'm on the opinion page. But people don't see the distinction between the opinion page, the editorial page, and the regular content of the news because it's being lost. Because I can't tell you how many times I've picked up a New York Times or the LA Times in some stories and read the story and just knew that there was a philosophical slant to the story rather than a straightforward presentation of the news. And I think people are tired of that. And I think that's why Fox News is doing so well. ABC, NBC, CBS, the major networks have always had this problem with not having an objective presentation of the news, and I think they're suffering because of it. You know, there's a story that happened just recently where you've had this pro-Iraq surge ad that was going to be aired from a Iraq, you know, Army veteran or military veteran's point of view. And MSNBC and CNBC decided not to run these ads because they didn't want to engage in that kind of philosophical ads or politically motivated ads. But they've incorporated those ads before. So I think people are just tired of this, and they want a factual presentation of the news. I think Fox goes to the other extreme, but it's a diversion from what the mainstream news is doing, and you know, my hat's off to them for doing it.
Now, you mentioned, you think, in your opinion, that liberals go into journalism. Why is that? Why is there not a balance of young kids coming up through J School who are more ideologically diverse?
Well, you know, I think it's the profession itself. You know, you go into it bright-eyed thinking that here's a way for you to change the world, and writing itself is sort of a creative art, which is, you know, liberal art. I think the cynicism manifests itself when you get these kind of creative people, you know, this idealistic creative people who get into this job thinking they're going to change the world, but when they get into the business of journalism, they have an editor really telling them, you know, what topics to cover. They've got a style book that tells them how they can write. And once they finish the act of doing their creative writing, you've got another editor who's chopping it down to size to make sure it fits a certain format. I think that ends up with being a bunch of creative, frustrated people with an axe to grind. And I think they take it out on their first philosophical target.
Now, you're sort of known for your legendary parties at your place. You have a great life here in Southern California. Tell us a little bit about you personally and what your life is like out here.
Well, let me say that Larry Craig has never been invited to one of my parties yet. You know, I love Southern California. I really grew up here. I live near my mother, and one of the great things about my job is that I have access to wonderfully creative people in all venues. And so in my parties, it incorporates you know, politicians and maybe a couple celebrities here and there, but mostly just great people from a diverse walk of life. And it's kind of neat to just see all these people from extremely different walks of life meet each other and talk about issues. You know, I also know a lot of musicians. I'm in a band that plays a lot of charity events, so it's great to see the politicians and the musicians get together, and music is something that everybody can agree on, it's nice to see that exchange.
What is a typical schedule like for you? Do you work out of your home? Do you go into the office? How do you work it out?
Well, you know, mostly I'm working from my home. We have editorial meetings every day at 8 o'clock. So I basically get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and I read the papers. You know, I always joke to people at my speeches that if you read the editorial page at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, somewhere between the two lies the truth. You can skip that now. You can just go right to IBD and you can find it right there. But I prep for the editorial meetings from about 5 to around 7:50, and then I will get a phone call, conference call with all my writers and editors, and Wes Mann, the editor. We just have some really brilliant writers, by the way, and editors at IBD. And we have these wonderful editorial meetings that last about 2 hours, and they're actually a lot of fun, and we'll cover a lot of ground. From that point, after we decide what's going to be on the editorial page, my job goes back to editorial cartooning, and I'll spend probably up until around 2 o'clock fashioning the cartoon. What I'm doing differently now is that at IBD, I'm now doing the cartoons in color. So I'll spend from about 2 o'clock to around 3 o'clock colorizing the cartoons. And then the process right after deadline, 3 o'clock, 3:30, begins all over again. And that's just reading material, watching the news, you know, I'm pretty boring. I'm probably one of the few people that actually likes to watch C-SPAN. So I'll watch C-SPAN and read magazines on politics. Just thinking about what I'm going to be doing for the next day.
What are your goals, both for yourself personally and for IBD?
Well, you know, I really want to raise I want to raise IBD up so that it becomes more familiar in the political realm and the mainstream. You know, just average American will know what IBD is, because it really is a terrific paper. And I think what we're doing on the editorial page is really different than most newspapers. and we're giving a more objective, factual presentation of the news with a hard line to it so that you'll know where to stand on the issues. We'll substantiate what those points are and make you more aware of what's going on. As a political cartoonist, well, you know, I've won 1 Pulitzer. I think Paul won 3, Jeff won 3. Now I'm a conservative cartoonist, so it may not happen, but I would like to equal their achievements. But mostly, I want to be able to reflect on my cartoons and say, you know, this year's body of work deserves a Pulitzer. And each individual cartoon had a significant impact, or has a possible impact to be the catalyst to make somebody get involved in self-governance, which I think is what all political cartoonists want to do.
Thanks for joining us, Michael.
My pleasure.